Welcome to TriloTalk. This is a podcast dedicated to topics that we think are important to the profession of medical writing. And our goal is to bring these topical issues and ideas to the forefront and spark conversations in the medical writing community.
Hello, I am Lisa Chamberlain James, and I'm a senior partner at Trilogy. Today, I'm joined by Julie Holtzople, President of Holtzople Consulting. Julie, have I pronounced your name correctly?
Yes, Holtzople, but either or, yes, it's good.
Holtzople, excellent,
Yes.
Brilliant. That's the only thing I've been stressed about for the whole of today. We're talking today about clinical trial transparency, which is one of Julie's specialities. So welcome to TriloTalks, Julie. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Lisa. It's my pleasure.
So why don't we start with something very basic for you, but perhaps not for our listeners. What is clinical trial transparency? It's a very hot topic, but what is it that we're actually talking about?
Sure. So clinical trial transparency is making clinical trial information available to all the stakeholders who need it or could use it or possibly want it. So that includes regulators, clinical researchers, patients, caregivers, and just the general public, and to do this in a way that meets their needs. So patients probably need information in a different way at different levels than, for example, a clinical researcher or a regulator.
Right, that makes complete sense. And so I presume a trial has to be transparent from start to finish, or does it just kick in at a certain point when the results come out, for example? What does this apply to?
Great question. So it actually started with registering trials many, many years ago. That was the first sign of transparency. So it really does start at the early stages of the trial, goes through to trial completion, and actually even to product submission at many levels in Europe and Canada and other parts of the world.
Okay, wow. So it really does cover everything. This is really important. And is it legally mandated, or is this just a recommendation? It obviously sounds like a good thing that we should be doing, but do we actually have to? Are there any teeth behind this?
Yes, that's a great question. So, yes, there are definitely regulations and requirements for a lot of this. So, registering trials is required, and even getting more required as things like ICH next level comes out. Even posting results is now not only required legally in different parts of the world, but becoming required just for a good clinical practice. There are also some components that are best practices in a lot of places and not required. So currently, sharing clinical trial data sets, for example, SAS data sets, that's not legally required in the form of data, but it is considered a best practice and has been in play for big pharma since, I think, 2014, when the principles for responsible data sharing were launched. So another example is plain language summaries of clinical trial results. They're now required in Europe with CTIS, but they've been best practice for a very long time. And not necessarily required in all parts of the world, but very much considered the right thing to do for patients. So there are definitely compliant components, and there's also best practices, and so it makes it interesting, and I think it's what also makes it an opportunity for clinical trial sponsors to actually do the right thing by being transparent for the right stakeholders and actually using it as a way to gain trust in the research and the products they're putting on the market.
Trust is such an important word when it comes certainly to information that's going out to patients and the general public. And it sounds like this is a really good initiative to actually help build that trust. And you've used the words best practice a lot. And I love that, because it's one thing knowing what we should be doing, and we all know what we should be doing really, but it's good to know there are some actual teeth behind that now, and there are more laws that are coming into force to actually mandate that and make that happen. Do you think that the main group of people this is aimed at is patients? Because you mentioned there are other stakeholders who might benefit from actually doing the right thing and adopting best practice in clinical trial transparency. Who do you see are the main groups that might benefit from doing this?
So that's a really interesting question to digest. And I think if you ask different stakeholders, you might get a different response. Patient centricity in clinical research has been a super important focus for, I don't know, the past 5 to 10 years. You'd think it should have always been super important, right?
Yeah.
But it's really become a buzzword in clinical research, and things have shifted um, to say everything is focused on the patients. And obviously, when we're doing clinical research, our job is to bring new treatments or protocols or best practices to light to really improve healthcare for everyone, right? And so ultimately, we're all patients.
Yeah.
Um, and so ultimately, clinical trial transparency is for patients. But to get to that point where we're improving the lives of the general public, it also has to be targeted to, for example, clinical researchers. So if you think about the wealth of clinical research information that's been collected since clinical trials started, so much of that, a trial's completed, it might see the light of day for a product submission, but then it sits on a shelf, right? It's never touched, never used again. And so the ability to actually standardize that information, anonymize it in a way that's safe for sharing, and get it into the hands of researchers so they can reuse it is really, when I've done sort of pushing on this, where I see the value coming in, right? If you, we actually did some work via FP a few years ago to try to figure out which transparency disclosure channels are driving the greatest value, and how do we define value? And it's a fun question to try to define what value is, but really the only place that we could look and see things were happening with the data was when pharma was sharing data sets with clinical researchers in some type of controlled environment, like, say, Vivli. And you could see they were able to take the data, do some analysis, and actually find something and then publish it. And when you see that publication cycle come to fruition, you know something's come out of it, right? So something new, because there's a barrier to being able to publish. It has to be
Yeah.
decent science and of interest, right? And so there's clear value coming from this part of the transparency ecosystem. And I think it's actually one of the undervalued ones. Um, I think the idea behind Health Canada's Policy 70 and Health Canada's PRCI and EMA's Policy 70 was to try to get this same data available, but it's not near as effective or safe for the patient data as when we share data in a controlled environment with qualified researchers, and we actually let them do research on a complete data set. So to me, that's where I really get excited. Obviously, plain language summaries and clinical trial results and registration, they all have value, right? Registering studies, you can help people who are looking for treatments that might not be mainstream yet locate treatment and facilities. And results are important because it helps everybody understand where the research is, what may be working, what isn't working, what they may want to pursue. So there's value in each of these pieces, but to me, I think so much opportunity comes from that controlled data set sharing with qualified clinical researchers.
I love that perspective. I think that's so interesting. And it's not a perspective that you hear very often when people are talking about transparency. People tend to kind of focus on the patient and the general public, which, of course, as we've discussed, is really, really important. But I really agree with you. I think this is a fascinating aspect to it. We saw a lot of it in COVID when everyone kind of threw competition and all the bad stuff out of the window and really said, okay, this is a human existential crisis. Let's all just battle down and try and share information. Of course, that can't be sustained in the same way. That was a crisis situation. But I think it's really interesting and really important aspect of transparency, the research aspect. Because, I mean, my background's as a research scientist, actually. So this is you've touched a topic very close to my heart. And when I'm explaining to my children what clinical development is all about and what clinical trials are, I always start by saying, they're just big experiments. It's just people trying to work out what works, what doesn't work, what has side effects, what doesn't have side effects. and they are just big experiments. And for any scientific research to be really had the most benefit globally, we have to share the data. Absolutely right. It saves so much time and effort. So I love that perspective, and it's great that you've brought that out in this discussion.
I think the one thing that I challenge people to think about when it comes to, are we doing transparency just for the public? So I'm not a physician. I'm not a data expert. I'm not trained as a scientist, right? I probably have a lot more experience with clinical research than the average person. But still, if I look at a clinical data set, right, and I have gotten my hands on them, I've used them to anonymize them, right? They don't tell me much. I'm not, it's sort of like, my check engine light came on in my car and I pop open the hood and I'm like, what do I do now, right? I'm no mechanic. I can check the oil, make sure there's oil in there and it's safe to keep going and it doesn't overheat, right? The basics. And so I really think when it comes to transparencies and the users of the data, we have to remember, I wouldn't ask a clinical research expert to fix my car engine, and I wouldn't ask a mechanic to give me conclusions about which COVID vaccines were working and what are the real side effects. And so it is about getting the right data to the right resources at the right time. And we shouldn't be skipping the value the physicians bring to this ecosystem, right? There's a lot of debate about patient narratives. Should they be in the public or not, right? And of course, Health Canada and EMA want to push disclose narratives in these CSRs. And I've had some pretty interesting discussions with the regulators around why. And, some of them can lead down a concerning rabbit hole, like, well, the patient should be able to read all the patient narratives and decide if they want to take the product or not. Nobody should be making decisions about medication based on one individual patient narrative.
Absolutely. Or even one study.
Right. Yes. Even if you look at the bigger picture, right?
Absolutely.
And this is the role that the safety boards have and the regulators have, and even, study leads and stuff, is to take all the data, bring it together, analyze it, torture it, right? And actually bring the conclusion out. So this idea that a patient should be able to read all the narratives and make their own decisions about which medicines they want, to me, can actually lead down a somewhat concerning path. And so I do think it is critical in transparency that we're looking at, how are we doing the right thing for all the stakeholders? How are we making the right data available to the right stakeholders? Always transparent, always driving trust, but also not saying, hey, here, patients, let me just throw you everything and you figure it out yourself. Because, most people,
they don't have the tools.
Right.
Right. No, I think that's a really, really important point, because I don't think there is a difference between giving patients the information that they need as long as it's contextualized, and just doing a data dump and expecting them to work it out. That's not helpful and actually can lead to more confusion. I totally agree with you. And when we're training writers, it's always like, don't just give the information, actually help them to understand what that information means. That's the contextualization. We're not there to teach people, obviously, but we are there to help them make sense of the information that we're giving them. And it's not easy. And I think it's probably coming from a good place. Let's make as much available as we can, but we are in an age of information overload. And I think if you just dump a whole load of stuff onto patients, actually they'll just turn off and won't even bother reading any of it. And then we've wasted all of that time and effort.
Well, you even hear regulators say that, right? They don't want CSRs that are 100,000 pages. They want a well-written, concise CSR that brings out the valid data points. And that's why this cycle has so many reviews, so many stakeholders at the table, so many trained folks. A CSR is not written by one person and then published, and it's that one person's point of view. And I always want to make it clear too, that I'm not advocating that we filter information in a sort of my bias perspective kind of way, right? I think it's important that we understand all the checks and balances in the process and how they're used, and how we bring transparency through each of those different points.
Oh yeah, no, I 100% agree. And you're right, CSRs are never just written by one person, although we are seeing that they're now maybe written by one AI agent or bot. So, and there's no way we could have a discussion about any topic these days without touching on AI. And I'd be really interested. I've just done a TriloTalk about agents and agentic AI. But it would be great. You're an expert in all things clinical trial transparency. What do you think about AI and its role in the transparency
Yep.
sphere?
Yeah. Great question. And you're right. Everybody is looking at how does AI make anything move faster and better. So I've actually had the opportunity to be part of building a anonymization tool that was using types of AI to help with looking at how to safely anonymize both the data sets for sharing data sets as well as the clinical study reports for publication on the agency portals. I mean, I think that's one of the big wins that's made a lot of progress over the past decade. I mean, the first vendors started building these tools when Policy 70 came online in 2014. Um, 2015, I guess, was the go live. But the concept of, hey, how are we going to automate this, right? Well, when you start to look at just data sets, it's much easier to do traditional coding with structured data. But when you come to CSRs, right, as a medical writer, there's about a billion different ways, despite there being standards, that CSRs can be written. Take something as basic as a patient ID, and there's probably 1,000 different ways to write it and reference it throughout a document. And so that starts to become a pretty interesting use case for AI and how you can automate it, how you can train systems to recognize different patterns and such. I think that's one of the big wins that is progressing. And the other one is we are starting to see how AI can help with drafting plain language summaries or the plain language summary of the protocol synopses that are published on CTIS now. I was actually part of a working group that looked at what would be best practices for this. SysCrypt published a paper recently around this. And I think we all really landed around this idea that there's a lot of great opportunity with what we're seeing AI be able to do with the first draft writing. And it is super important that humans are still in the loop to look at the outcome and make sure there's no hallucination, make sure it's meeting all the requirements that go into a well-written plain language summary. And so these are two really obvious ways I'm seeing AI. I'm also seeing, I saw an agent demonstrated to me recently that took a protocol and drafted the registration for ct.gov. And again, then the human needs to go and make sure that that's actually working. But I think there's a lot of automating those manual tasks that these AI agents are starting to be able to do. And then you can take the human expert and have them verify, did they describe the inclusion criteria right? Did they pick the right endpoints? Did they include all the secondary endpoints? That kind of stuff.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think as long as there is a human aspect to that and a human checking element, and a human there to provide the strategic and critical thinking around the document, I think there's huge benefits in generative and agentic AI, and I think we're just starting to see that come through now. So,
Yep.
and I know you mentioned the paper that the group you're part of wrote about the responsible use of AI in lay summary generation, and I would urge our listeners to definitely go look up that paper. It's very pragmatic, very sensible. I was very impressed by it, Julie. So thank you to you and your group for putting something sensible out there. There's a lot of rubbish that's being put out there about AI, but that was completely on point. So I think it's a really excellent paper and excellent work. Thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah, it was a fun group to be part of. Great debating to get to where we landed. So
yeah, I can completely imagine. I know a couple of the members of the group, so I can imagine it was a great fun exercise, and certainly a fantastic piece of work has come out at the end. So as an expert, what advice would you give to our listeners, so sponsors, regulators, or writers who would like to do better with transparency? I hope that we've managed to convince people that they should be doing better with transparency. So what advice would you give to them to get started?
Wow. To get started. Those getting started, I would say, don't reinvent the wheel. Look at the best practices out there. There's folks like me that have been around this for a long time, and we've learned a lot the hard way. I would say, obviously, part of it's a compliance exercise, and that's the baseline. But what's really important is focusing on the value add. And so, how do you define transparency as a value to your stakeholders? And how do you focus on creating value add from it? So, I would encourage all in this space to really think about, how do we minimize repeating the disclosure of the same information in 65 different formats, right? How do we focus on making sure what's really creating value is actually getting out there and getting into the hands of the right people? So for a while, I've been really focused on this idea of transparency as a value add, not a compliance exercise. And I think for, some of the things that really get me excited is the idea of talking to a younger sponsor company that's really coming into transparency and saying, all right, how do I approach this, right? I got to make sure I get ct.gov right. Yeah, okay, that's the basics.
Yeah.
But let's talk about where the value is, and what you're going to do for plain language summaries, how you're going to get those right, and how are you going to make the data available to qualified researchers so it can be reused, right? These are the areas that are exciting and provide great opportunity. And I think, you mentioned data sharing. The structured data sharing is one of those things that really it doesn't get a lot of play because it's not the legal requirement. And I think there's a lot of discussion about the legal requirement. And I'll throw it out there largely because I think that's where vendors make money, right? Vendors can go at sponsors and say, you got to do it. Let me do it for you, right? Whereas structured data sharing is something that a smaller portion of sponsors have tackled because it's the right thing to do. But I think it's such a missed opportunity. And so I really hope that as we look towards the future, that controlled structured data sharing gets a lot more play. And I think it will with EHDS coming online in Europe, right? The data sharing is going to become mandatory through EHDS, which is still in the planning, operationalizing, implementing phase. But I think that's really going to shift things over the next 5 to 10 years for good.
Excellent. And that seems like a very positive and uplifting place to end our discussion today, Julie. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you as always. Well, I really hope that our listeners have learned a lot about the importance and the challenges and the solutions to clinical trial transparency. Thank you so much for joining me today on TriloTalks.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you for listening to TriloTalk today. If you have feedback you'd like to share, or if you have any ideas for future topics you'd like us to cover, particularly something you think the community should be talking about, we would love to hear it. We would like this to be an ongoing conversation with medical writers at large, and you can send us your comments on our Twitter feed or our LinkedIn page. Just a reminder, you can find all our episodes of TriloTalk podcast on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Podcasts, Spotify, and trilogywriting.com/TriloTalk. Have a great rest of your day.